Copyright the University of Auckland. All rights reserved. The content and delivery of lectures in this course are protected by copyright. Material belonging to others may have been used in these lectures and copied by and solely for the educational purposes of the university under license. You may record the lectures for the purposes of private study or research, but you may not upload onto any third-party site, make a further copy, or sell, alter, or further reproduce or distribute any part of these lectures to any other person. Failure to comply with the terms of this warning may expose you to legal action for copyright infringement by the copyright owner and/or disciplinary action by the university.
Okay, so kia ora koutou. Welcome to the Mathematics Department colloquium, the second one this week with Chad. It's really fantastic having Chad visiting for a couple of weeks. His visit is supported by the Mathematics Department and the Faculty of Science Equity Committee, and was organised by Claire. So Chad's a man of many interests. He's studied mathematics, obviously, applied mathematics, and he's interested in a wide range of areas in mathematics. But he's also got interested in social justice and equity and inclusion and lots of other things as well. He founded the Institute for the Quantitative Study of Inclusion, Diversity and Equity, so QSIDE, which I guess is the logo that we're looking at, and has worked on a lot of very cool things that we're about to hear about art galleries and editorial boards and so forth. And I also wanted to acknowledge his contributions to the responses to the essay by Abigail Thompson.
I will, in fact, talk about that.
And I kind of just wanted to highlight the fact that a lot of this kind of work, it takes a certain amount of guts because you're going to get flack, and I think you received some feedback on your responses to Abigail.
In fact, I have.
And yeah, it takes a lot of courage to stand up and put your neck out and enter the public domain with opinions. So. Appreciate your work in this regard. Anyway,
thanks for saying that. Thank you. It is such a pleasure to be here with you. I just want to start out by saying that this trip has been amazing. And yesterday, my family and I went to Hobbiton, and this is what it looks like. And my mind was absolutely blown, and that has been a wonderful part of this trip. Also, so that's my family in the back, by the way, my husband and my daughter. And my daughter has been getting some good cultural New Zealand education while here, so she drew this for me that I wanted to share. There's the kiwi bird, the kiwi fruit, the kiwi human, and the kiwi dollar. So we're all learning. And so really, thank you so much for having me here. It's a great privilege and a great pleasure. While I'm here, you are getting all of my weird talks. I swear I do give normal talks, but you're not getting any of them. I gave a talk about inclusive teaching and educational psychology, even though I'm not an educational psychologist. That was on Tuesday of this last week. And then coming on Thursday of next week, I'm giving a talk about topological data analysis. This is a research talk, but it's not for topologists, and I've never taken topology. And then there's this other talk, which is a talk about social justice given by a white upper middle class cisgender man who can't figure out what sort of talk this is even supposed to be. That's happening right now. And so this is just to bring your attention to the fact that this might not be like most, I don't know, maybe it will be, but it might not be like most colloquia you get. So there are some unconventional things in this talk. There's personal narrative in here, which I don't usually give in my research talks. Definitely some personal opinions. There's also probably a bit of cultural translation that I can't do, right? There are certain things and social frameworks that are true in the US, where I'm from, that may not hold true here, and I'm really excited to learn about what similarities and differences there might be. I'm going to purposefully tell you about way too many projects, and I'm going to give you purposefully not enough detail about any of them, and that's because my message today is really not about the research results of any one of those projects. It's much more me trying to demonstrate that by working on social justice research problems, mathematicians can have an impact. And that's what I'm going to be emphasizing. And I used to think that the part of me that cared about social justice and the part of me that was interested in doing quantitative things had to be like separate parts, like working in parallel. And I have recently realized that they can actually be brought together. And then, of course, because it's me, there will be some sarcasm. Who in the room is, a student or a postdoctoral fellow or something like that? Anyone? Okay, quite a number of you. So if I could give a piece of wisdom or advice, it's that life is a really super directed linear path where you have to decide what you're going after and just go there as directly as possible. And so I want to share with you the story of my life in quantitative social justice, which of course is nothing like that. And this is, believe it or not, the outline of my talk, and it involves academic institutions and math journals and art museums and professional music and university admissions and the US criminal justice system and lots of other things that I hope to tell you about today. But if you only take away one thing from this talk, this is it. So this is a person from the US who lived in the late 19th, early 20th century. Her name's Ida B. Wells. She's an educator and a journalist and a civil rights leader. And she has this quotation that really inspires me. And it says, "The way to right wrongs is to shine the light of truth upon them." And I think mathematics and quantitative approaches, even though they always have built-in bias that we need to be aware of, I think they are a really powerful form of that light of truth. Okay, so this story starts at Northwestern University in Chicago, where I was a PhD student. And this is my PhD advisor. Her name's Mary Silber. And then after I went to graduate school, I went and I did a postdoc. This is Andrea Bertozzi, who's an applied mathematician. And this already, at least in the States, makes me very, very unusual, because most mathematicians in the States have 0 women as supervisors, and I only had women as supervisors. And they never really spoke to me explicitly about issues of representation of women in the field, but at some point I started to sort of notice that they were very often literally the only woman in the room. Fast forward a bit, this is the year 2013. I was running a summer research group. The guy in the back row is my collaborator, Andy Burnoff, who's from Harvey Mudd College in the US, and the guy on the top right was one of his students from Harvey Mudd. But the 4 women pictured there were my 4 research students from my institution that summer. And I got my little email announcement that we get every so often from the Society for Industrial Applied Math. So my SciAm email comes, and it's announcing that year's SciAm Fellows. And it turns out that of the few dozen fellows that they inaugurated that year, I think there were 2 women on the list. And I was sort of reading this news in the lab with my students and probably appearing a bit upset about it. And my students said, "What's up?" So I told them, and they said, "Wow, that's really grim." And so I started to think about that, you know? Around the same time, I should say, we had a daughter, Judah and I, and that's Maya in the back. And Maya actually really likes math, and she would often come to my office at Macalester College, where I was at the time, and we would work on little problems together. That also got me thinking about sort of the participation and representation of women in mathematics. And so I decided I should start to try to do something. And so I have a dream that one day I will write one of these coffee table, you know those big fancy coffee table books? I have a dream that I'm gonna write one, and it's Chad's coffee table book of angry letters that I've written. Is anybody else an angry letter writer? Yeah, okay. And so I wrote to SciAm, and I was like, what's the deal? I found myself trying to explain why of the 33 new fellows, there were only 2 women. Like, what's up with that? And so anyone who has written this sort of letter knows that often what happens when you write this sort of letter to a society, you get something back, and that thing is a committee assignment. And so that's how I started to become involved a little bit on a policy level in these things. But then I decided, okay, well, I've had this one sort of experience noticing issues of women's participation, but I want to learn more. So I started to kind of research the history of women in mathematics a bit. And so I will now present to you what I call an incomplete history of women mathematicians treated horribly over 4 centuries. These might be, I don't know if you're familiar with these stories, but if you're not, they might be interesting to you. So this is Sophie Germain. Many of you probably know her. And when she was growing up in France, she was quite avid about mathematics, and she would like to stay up late studying and reading math books. And her parents thought this was very, culturally out of place and unbefitting for a young woman. So what they would do was they would put out her fire and take away her clothes at night so that she would be so cold and uncomfortable that she couldn't focus on doing mathematics, and she would have to just go to sleep. This is Sofia Kovalevskaya. She was in Russia, and women in Russia at the time were not allowed to enter university. She wanted to study abroad to leave the country so that she could study mathematics. In order to do that, she needed the permission of a man she was related to, a man in her family. So she got married so that she could get permission in order to leave the country and study abroad, study math. This is Emmy Noether, who taught for 7 years at an institute in Germany without pay, doing the work for free. And this is Alice Schaefer from the US. And she was an undergraduate student at University of Richmond in Virginia, the state of Virginia. And at that time, so this is in the 20th century, women were not allowed inside the campus library at University of Richmond. So this is sort of the historical, a bit of the historical landscape. After learning these things, I decided I would like to learn what's going on right now, what's the current state of things. And so I'll present you with some figures from the US, and what I'm showing you is various time series that have to do with the proportion of various groups who are women. And the two curves I'm showing you now are bachelor's degrees awarded in all fields in solid blue, and bachelor's degrees in mathematics in the dotted blue, and that's all fields of the mathematical sciences.
Is this just the US? Or?
Just the US, yeah. So all the statistics I have are just US, and so this is why I said I'm curious to learn more about what things are like here. And so, of course, one thing you might notice is that it's quite a bit lower in mathematics than it is in all fields at large. This is at the doctoral level, you see the same pattern. And this is at the faculty level. There's much less data because we didn't start keeping good track of it until really around the year 2000. So there's much less data available, but same pattern. And then this is just showing you the 3 curves for the field of mathematics. And so what you see is the usual thing you see, which is attrition at every level as one kind of progresses through the profession from bachelor's degrees to doctoral degrees to faculty jobs. And this is quite a common pattern. And maybe you're thinking to yourself, like, Chad, this is such a heartwarming story of like, how you had these women mentors, and you had a daughter, and you like learned these trials and tribulations, and you had this like awakening about like underrepresentation really mattering. And I would very much like for you to not feel that way. I actually feel a bit embarrassed that that is how I came to it. I think that there are at least 2 reasons that we should care about the participation of women in mathematics, and one of those is just because it's morally and ethically proper. And I think the second reason is because if you care about mathematics, and if you want the field to be the best that it should be, why would you want anybody excluded from participation in the field? We need everyone. If you want the most math to get done, you want all the best people involved, and that includes women. Okay, so let's move on to Facebook. So one day, when I'm no longer on Facebook, but I used to be quite avid. And when I was, there was a post, this is from a friend of mine in 2015, and she said, in preparation for submitting a journal article to the Journal of Differential Geometry, I went to make contact with one of the editors. Turns out there's no women on the editorial board. Does anyone know what the situation is on editorial boards in general? And it turns out no one does. And so we decided to try to figure it out. And so this is how we come to the Journal of Differential Geometry and many other journals. Now you can ask, Chad, why do you really care about editorial boards? And I want to give you 4 reasons. One is that they're just indicators for how the field is doing at large, right? The same way we might look at faculty or doctoral degrees, we can look at editorial boards. But also these are engines of professional networking and advancement, right? So those of you who are on editorial boards, you know it's like the first time you got asked, it probably like felt good. It's kind of like a fancy thing. It's a way of being visible. It's a way of meeting other people. I think these boards are also important because they are, in a sense, the drivers of research, right? Editors are deciding what gets published and what doesn't, so there's some ability to shape the direction of the field. And also there's the sort of role model effect or possible selves effect that can influence the retention of women. And what the possible selves effect means is that if you have a goal, say, and you look at the people who have achieved that goal, and you see that none of them share identity characteristics that are identity characteristics that you have and are important to you, then your tendency to believe that you can become that thing is diminished. okay? And this is well documented in the psychological literature. And so I really do think that editorial boards matter. And so here's what we did. We did a study that involves crowdsourcing. Who's heard of Amazon Mechanical Turk? Anybody? Okay, so this is the same Amazon where you might just, can you get Amazon delivery quickly, I assume? Not quickly, no, okay. Anyway, it's the same Amazon. It is the same Amazon, but this is a different part of the business. It's a crowdsourcing labor platform, and it's full of workers who, for small amounts of money that they'll receive, will do online tasks called HITs, H-I-T. That stands for Human Intelligence Task. And these are things that are still very difficult to program a computer to do, but are very easy for humans to do. Originally, a classic example would be like if you were an online retailer and you had a bunch of pictures of products, you would pay humans on Mechanical Turk to tag them with keywords for you. It still is really hard for a computer to do that, but a human can say red, bicycle, and whatever. But a computer has a much harder time. But now, these get used for research. MTurk gets used for research in computer science and behavioral economics and all sorts of other fields, and gets used for all kinds of other industry tasks as well. So I'll tell you in a moment how we used it. This was our study methodology. We went to the Web of Science, which is a database that has a lot of information about academic publications in it, and we just looked up what are all the journals that are tagged as belonging to mathematics. And I think there were 620 some odd of them. And what we did was we wrote code to scrape that list of journals, and sadly, all you can scrape, all that's there, is the abbreviation for the journal. This is really a pain. I have no idea what An, Acad, Sci, Fen, M is. Do you know that journal? Some of you might, but I did not. So then what we did was we paid Mechanical Turk workers to go figure it out for us, go Google and figure this out for us. Okay, this was the journal that it actually is. So then we had 600 and some odd journal titles, and then we deployed those journal titles to Mechanical Turk, and we said, please go to all these different web pages of all these different journals and write down for us all the members of the editorial board. It turned out to be impossible for us to write code to do that task, because every journal is storing the information in a different way, even within the same publisher. Journals within the same publisher. So we didn't want to write 620 pieces of code, so we paid people small amounts of money to do this for us. And then, once we had all the names from the editorial boards, we deployed those to Amazon Mechanical Turk, and we asked people to go, please give us their best inference of the person's gender. There's a lot buried in that statement I just made, and in the next project I'll tell you about, I will give you a little more insight into how things like gender inference work. But for now, just to tell you what would happen is we would get back like a list of editorial board names from our MTurk workers, and then we would run them through an algorithm called genderize.io. And it's basically a big lookup table. And it would say like, okay, we have a bunch of data for which we know the genders of people because they've self-identified on social media and we've scraped all their data. And I'm gonna look up the name Linda in that lookup database, and of the 1,000 Lindas who were in the database, 999 of them self-identified as being women, and so with pretty high probability, your Linda is a woman as well. Okay? So what we did was we accepted the gender inferences that had a very high confidence rating on them, and then for the ones that did not, like this one here, right? We didn't. The algorithm didn't know if this was Jan, possibly a woman, Jan, possibly a man, right? We deployed those names to Amazon Mechanical Turk, and with the full names as well as the information about the journal, and asked the workers to please research them autobiographically or biographically, and like figure out for us, can you find pronouns in which they refer to themselves? Can you find pictures insofar as we can use those? Can you find anything and try to infer this person's gender? So then we would have inferred genders of people. We did a calibration method where we subsampled a small number of records, and we checked ourselves to see how we think the algorithm and the crowd did, and we served as the experts and took our own responses to be the correct ones because we actually know these people. And so we did a little bit of data calibration. So like here, where we thought we had something like 5 men and 1 woman, after our calibration procedure, we decided that on average we had 4.9 men, 0.99 women, and I think 0.01, sorry. I don't know if my math adds up. No, I'm fine. And 1.11 could not determine, okay? So in the end, we got data for 435 of the 600 some odd journals, and it consisted of 13,067 editorships. I'm not going to show you all the results, but here's an example of what we found. We found that overall, the percentage of women on editorial boards was 8.9%. Okay? And this is just to point out that you see this continuing pattern of decreased participation at every level of the profession. Here's some more results. This is just a histogram of the proportion of editorships held by women for each journal. And this spike at the left is 61 journals, close to zero. 52 of them have exactly 0 women on the editorial boards, at least at the time we were in the study in 2015. And some of those journals are some of the very most prestigious journals in mathematics. There are a lot of other results. We looked at the role of publishing house, the role of country, the role of subfield of mathematics, all of these things. So if you want to ask me questions about those later, please feel free. Okay, and then I want to say, I don't want this to be, I don't want to overstate this, but I think that doing this work had some influence. When we showed people that you could do this on a large scale and start to try to quantify some of these things, we started sort of seeing similar studies happen, and I don't know if they were inspired by ours, but we started seeing other studies happen in fields like accounting and ecology and geosciences and other things. Also, I was certainly not the only one to raise alarm about the low representation of women amongst SIAM fellows. Lots of other people did as well, and eventually SIAM formed a canvassing committee that is separate from its fellow selection committee, and the job of this committee is simply to build a broad pool of nominees. Okay, so now we have to talk about art museums. In 2017, I moved from Macalester College in Minnesota to Williams College in Massachusetts. So this is my family moving halfway across the country. And when we arrived at Williams, here was a Facebook conversation that I saw. It was, did anyone notice that basically all of the artists shown in the new Mass MoCA Building 6 are white dudes? Now, for those of you who don't know, Mass MoCA is the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, which everyone thinks is in Boston, but it's not. It's as far from Boston as you can get and still be in the state of Massachusetts, in the far northwest of the state. It is also the 4th largest museum in the States, which people in the States don't even know, but it's the 4th largest museum, and it's quite a thing, and you should come visit me there sometime. It's 10 minutes from our house. So I said, I'm not in the art world. Like, is this typical? Like, is diversity problems a thing in art museums? And my artist friend says, oh yes, this is like a widespread problem. And I said, how bad? And they said, like, real bad. And I'm like, but how bad? And they're like, we don't know. Nobody knows. And this is true of a lot of things, right? Where we have an anecdotal sense, but we might not have measured the scope of the problem yet. So I am certainly not the first person to think about issues of gender and race and ethnicity in art. This is an amazing group called the Guerrilla Girls, who have been around at least since the 1980s, possibly earlier, that are very much concerned about the representation of women in art. So here's a typical sort of poster or piece of art they'll put up, pointing out that in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, 5% of the artists in the modern section are women, but 85% of the nudes are of women, right? So they like to point out disparities like this. Also, here's a quite influential article from 1990. This is from a magazine called Art in America. The title of the article is, Are Art Museums Racist? Quick answer, yes. But the quotation I want to stick a pin in for now is this one. It says, the Dallas Museum of Art, for example, has instituted progressive programming in order to confront the reality that our museums are devoted almost exclusively to the representation of white culture. And that was sort of a realization that they came to at this early year of 1990. So stick a pin in that one. So what we did was we decided to use methodology similar to the one we used for editorial boards to try to figure out genders and ethnicities and national origins and birth years of artists whose works are held in the catalogs of 18 major US art museums. So we went online, we worked with art historians who were members of our research team to identify the right museums to use. We scraped their online catalogs, we sampled from them because we couldn't do all of the artists in all of the museums. So here we're trying to make some statistical estimations. And so typically we would have information like this that we'd scrape. We'd have, from a museum webpage, the name of an artist and a link or an image where if you click on it, you can get more information about the artwork or the artist or both. But we would deploy whatever we had to Amazon Mechanical Turk. We would say, please go figure out biographical information for us about this artist. And I want to show you a little bit more now what this process looks like. We tell people you're going to see information about an artist, and we want you to make your best inference about their gender, ethnicity, national origin, and birth year. Here are some sources you might use, but basically anything you want. And I think it's very important to tell you how we're asking the questions. So we say, what is the gender of the artist? Here's how you might choose to answer. It's very important not to box yourself into a gender binary. So there's an option that is non-binary or gender non-conforming. Also, we give people the option to indicate that they just couldn't decide, right? We also give them the option to indicate that actually the particular work of art they were given was not made by an individual artist. Perhaps it was made by a collective, right? Perhaps it was unnamed, right? Because it was ancient or something. Also, we ask people how confident they are in their response, right? They were a little bit confident, more confident, or extremely confident. And we would take those gender inferences and confidence ratings, and we had a way numerically that we would combine them into a score. And based on that score, if there was enough confidence, we would infer that the person was a man or a woman or non-binary. So we can come back to this question about if art museums are racist and about the Dallas Museum trying to improve its programming. There's way too much on the next slide for you to parse. I don't expect you to absorb any of this at all. But there's 18 art museums here, and what I'm showing you is the percentage at each art museum that are women, that are Asian, that are Black, Hispanic, Latino, white, or other ethnicity. Highlighted in green are percentages that stand out as being statistically significantly higher than the rest of the pool at large, and in red are ones that are like less diverse, lower. And so, but you can see that even overall, it's only 12% women, and 1.2% Black and 2.8% Latinx. So these are very low figures. This is the circled numbers just to point out that at the Dallas Museum of Art last year, it still is 88.7% white artists. So I'm not sure that their programming efforts have been that effective. Now, a common comment that I get is, well, Chad, of course, if a museum focuses on 19th century impressionistic art, it's going to be mostly white men. Like, what are you going to do? And it turns out that that is not the case. So here's what I'm showing you. We have given each museum, so each dot here is a museum, and we've given each museum a profile, like a vector of numbers that represents that museum. And the numbers in that vector are on top things like the average artist birth year, so time period, right? And then the percentage from different areas of the world. And we call these collection habit demographics because this is more or less the way museums collect. We do 20th century Asian art a lot. We do 17th century European art, whatever it is. Often they do many of those things, right? But that's what we're trying to crudely capture here. And then on the bottom, I'm showing you what we call the artist diversity demographics. So this is, gender and ethnicity. In the plots, just because it's easier to see, I've projected down into 2 dimensions that separate the data pretty well. And so on top, it's birth year and North American origin. And on the bottom, it's proportion white and proportion women. And then we've clustered the data, which you can see indicated by color, but we've clustered the data in the higher dimensional data, okay? And so we get these different groups, and I'll just try to call out for you that museums that have similar collection habits, meaning they're close to each other in the top graph, can have drastically different artist diversity demographics, meaning they're farther apart in the bottom graph. And it goes the opposite way as well. But to be more specific, you can look at the 2 items that I've boxed. MFAB is the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, DIA is the Detroit Institute of Arts. You can see that they're quite similar in terms of like the average birth year of their artists and the proportion of artists who come from North America. On the other hand, look down here. They have more or less the same proportion of women, but the Detroit Institute of Arts is like almost 15 percentage points more white than the Museum of Fine Arts Boston is. Okay, now a big caveat is that this is only for artworks where there's an identifiable individual artist. So the rest are left out, but at least within that subset, we saw that to be true. And I think what this suggests to me is that actually, like, if you would like to build a more diverse collection, that trying works. Okay, so then a really cool thing that happened out of this was that I should go back. One of the museums that came out looking real bad was the National Gallery of Art, like our national US art museum in Washington, DC. That's the fourth row here, where you can see that it is, let's see, 97.4% white, right? Which I think is like, sorry, 97.4. It's the second worst in the whole bunch. And it only has around 10 percentage points of women artists in the collection. So they actually saw our work and they invited us to come and hack around with their internal data. So now this isn't data crudely scraped from the web. This is like their giant database of stuff. And it was great. They invited 6 academic teams, like of faculty members, to do this, as well as 1 student team. So Jude, my husband Jude, who's at Bennington College, he sent one of his students to come work on this. I sent one of my students from Williams College, that's her here, and a couple of other students. The student project, which I'm not going to tell you about today, was actually the best one. They beat all of the faculty members. But what we did with my faculty collaborators was just look again at some of these diversity measures. And I'm just showing you one quick result here. Within the National Gallery of Art, there are actually 111,000 objects, okay? 9.8% of those are produced by women, and 3.9% are produced by people of color. Amongst the artists, there are 14,000 artists who have made those works because there are many multiple works by a given artist. And so if you look at it by artist, it's 10.4% women and 2.6% people of color. So a little different, but not too different. Then you look at what's on the walls in the museum. And what's typical for all art museums is that they have between 1% and 2% of their collection on the walls at any given time. So there's a lot of discretion, right, in what they're deciding to put up. And amongst the 1,500 or so objects that are on the walls, at least before 2015, around 2% of them were by women and 1% by people of color. Things went a little crazy here because they started remodeling, shifting things around, and trying to do a bit better, but the numbers are still quite low. And so one thing we were trying to point out with this project is that they could choose to only display works by women and people of color. Like they could decide tomorrow, like we're just gonna take that stuff from our collection and put it on the walls and be done with it. Okay, we also made a little interactive tool. So this is like an interactive web app. Do you know Shiny? I know R was made here. So do you know Shiny? Shiny is part of R that you can use to make interactive data exploration apps. And so that's what this is. It allows you to look at individual rooms in the museum and choose a date and choose like gender or ethnicity and see what's actually on the walls there. And so this went well. And so then Jude and I decided to start an institute because we thought this is working. And the institute is called Institute for the Quantitative Study of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity. That's not it. It has no building, but in my head one day, that's what it looks like. And so here's the institute. You can follow us on Twitter or look at our web page if you want to. But our vision is really to bring quantitative expertise together with expertise from the social sciences, humanities, and arts to discover the impact and scope of injustices and to build solutions to remedy them. And so that vision is supported by a 4-part mission. We try to build capacity for collaborative research, and that's because mathematicians and like women's and gender studies, women's gender and sexuality studies scholars don't talk to each other a lot and don't usually have a lot of shared vocabulary. And so we have to get some of the vocabulary shared and and get them in the same place talking to each other, right? So we're trying to build capacity for this kind of research. We're trying to actually conduct the research. We're trying to inform the public through data transparency, because there are a lot of pieces of data that in principle are public, but in practice are not public, and we're trying to make it public. And then we're trying to not just do research, but to partner with people who are empowered to act upon the stuff that we discover. And so let me go back now from the founding of our institute back to the world of mathematics for a quick moment. So Stephen alluded to this. This has been a saga that's been unfolding over the past couple months. So in November, a vice president of the American Mathematical Society published an essay in the notices of the American Mathematical Society, which is the most widely read mathematics publication in the world. And I don't know how this works here. I'm curious to know, but in the States, you know, when you apply for a faculty position, people now are asking not just for a research statement and a teaching statement, but they're asking for a statement of contributions to equity, diversity, and inclusion. This is pretty commonplace. And this person who wrote the essay said that using those things is equivalent to McCarthyism. Do you know what McCarthyism is? Yes, okay. So McCarthyism was this thing that happened in the 1950s in the United States where there was a communism scare. And Senator Joseph McCarthy was going around accusing people of being communists and asking them to take loyalty oaths and so forth. And so she was saying that sort of asking people to write a statement of contributions to equity, diversity, and inclusion is like asking people to take a loyalty oath. And I sort of disagree. And so I chimed in, and 1,425 other mathematicians chimed in a big public online debate about this. And some of them said, no, it is not McCarthyism, and these diversity statements are important. Some of them said, well, no comment, but instead of people being upset that you published this, we just need civil discourse and debate. And then a third group of people said that the use of these diversity statements is a mistake and that they, quote, diminish mathematical achievement. And so what we did is a group of about 10 of us, myself, Jude, our associate director of institutional research at Williams College, some other people in the math community got together, and we did a sort of crowdsourced data scraping study of the people who expressed these three views by signing public letters that they submitted to have published by the American Mathematical Society. And here's what we found. So first of all, I'm showing you 4 different groups here and the number of people in each group. So 586 people said no, diversity statements are good. 563 said we need discussion and debate. 135 said diversity statements are a mistake and they diminish mathematical achievement. And 73 said both of the last 2 things. Civil discussion and debate, also they're a mistake. And then what the bar graph shows you is within each group, the percentage of that group who are men, not members of an underrepresented ethnic group, tenured and situated at highly research-intensive institutions. So you can see that the diversity statements are good group has about 5.6% composition of those people, and then this group at the bottom is 83.6% comprised of those people. And we also had on our team a historian and a sociologist who wrote some really nice analysis of the results through frameworks of power drawn from the social sciences. So that paper is in final revision and I think will be out pretty soon. The brouhaha created around this did lead to the university in question, UC Davis, to come out its leadership, the chancellor and the vice chancellor publishing a very high profile piece in the Wall Street Journal that said, we disagree with what this professor wrote. It's inaccurate, it's illogical, it's inflammatory. It reminds us of things that happened when people didn't want the US to be desegregated. And we think contributions to diversity are as important as those to teaching and research. Okay, so I'll quickly run through a few other projects that QSide is thinking about right now. One has to do with professional orchestras. So it turns out that my family, we like music a lot, and that's another part of our lives. So I'm really interested in this world. And I don't know how much you know about professional orchestras, but it used to be that when you audition for a professional orchestra, you just like walk on stage and you play, and the panel that's judging you judges you, and they pick the one. And then people realized, wow, there are not a lot of women in orchestras, and maybe there's some bias going on. So in the late 70s, early 80s, they started having these auditions at the last stage in the finals be screened. So they would put a screen up. You would walk on stage so that the panel couldn't see who was playing, and they would play and choose. And what this particular article from a couple years ago was about is like, well, maybe we should do the same thing in business. But I'm still focused on the music world. And so we're just doing this study of, we're wondering, A, if this has continued to work, and B, if it's different for principal players, like the head player of each section of the orchestra. And the reason is that for principal players, the final auditions are still unscreened. And so we're trying to compare what happens for the screened auditions with what happens for the unscreened ones. So I'm working with an undergraduate student and a friend of mine who's a professional violinist. She made us a list of 53 orchestras that she thinks of as being she and her colleagues think of as being sort of primary professional orchestras in the US. Then what we did was we found data about those orchestras, things like their annual budget, the number of subscription weeks that they run, the total number of concerts per year that they run. We clustered them, right, and we decided to only look at orchestras in these first two groups, which are sort of the higher tier. It was nice. The clustering sort of naturally found the ones that are naturally considered the higher tier orchestras in the States. And so what my student has just finished doing is scraping information about the players, their instruments that they play, and whether or not they're a principal. That's all available on the web for all these orchestras. And then what we're about to do is crowdsource gender and ethnicity and do some statistics and see what we find. Now we can talk about doctors' prescriptions. So actually, here's a little contest. This is New Zealand versus USA. You want to guess who's going to win? Okay, so this is what I saw yesterday or the other day when I was walking around campus. Who was I with? Was I with you, Claire? I was with Claire, and we walked past this, and I was like, oh my goodness, this is your health service. This is amazing, like emergency contraceptive pill right there. Okay, in the US, here's an article from the Washington Post about how a woman who had a condom failure tried to go to her pharmacy to get emergency contraception, and the pharmacist said, actually, no, I don't feel like giving that to you. It conflicts with my beliefs. So New Zealand wins. And so the question is, can a pharmacist refuse to dispense medication based on their personal beliefs? So it turns out in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 states, one of which I am lucky enough to live in, the answer is no, because the law explicitly forbids it. It says, if you're a pharmacist, you've got to give the medication. It turns out that in these states, second bullet point, you can refuse based on your beliefs, with the caveat that it's required by law that you help the customer find another place to get the prescription filled. You're supposed to transfer their prescription, help them locate another pharmacy close by. Then, in these states, it's explicitly fine. Just, sure, refuse if you want. And then, in 29 other states, who knows, because there's just no law about it in those states. This is what it's like living in the States. So, in case you're wondering what sorts of prescriptions might be involved, they might be things for contraception, they might be things for emergency contraception, they might be things that are given in order to terminate a problematic pregnancy, right? If a pregnancy has been determined to be not viable, the doctor will prescribe the person carrying the baby one of these drugs that they go get filled at the prescription, and if it's at an early enough stage of the pregnancy, and that terminates the pregnancy. I think also Truvada, which is pre-exposure prophylaxis for HIV, probably experiences some of these refusals. I think probably hormones given to transgender people are refused, and who even knows what else. And the reason I'm being so vague about this is because there's no systematic data, right? So no one really actually knows what is being refused and how often. And so we have a little project going now that's to try to crowdsource data about this. And this has been an exercise in learning a lot about data and research ethics and how to try to do this in an ethical way. But we're essentially trying to gather some data about where this happens, when this happens, who it happens to, what drugs are involved. And then if we get enough data, we'll be able to analyze it a little bit. let's see. We're working on a problem that has to do with diversity in universities, like among students. And I'm not sure if you're familiar, do you have this notion of affirmative action in New Zealand? No. Okay. So affirmative action in the US, this is the idea of policies in which individuals' identities are taken into account in order to increase opportunities for minoritized groups, groups that have been discriminated against, especially in areas such as education, employment, and housing. These are very legally contentious policies, and they're always in court. So it's never really quite clear exactly when you can have an affirmative action policy and when you can't. But my student Daniel Mays, now his work continued on by my student Julia Tukar. They're looking at student diversity at the University of California, Berkeley, because Berkeley is very public about all of their data. You can get it all online. And they're thinking about the concept of critical mass. And when they talk about critical mass and affirmative action, they're talking critical mass means like having enough of one group, one demographic group, basically so that they are not tokenized on campus. And the idea of my students' model was that to date, I mean, there's been quantitative work done on this, but it's all like retrospective. Meaning like people try to do something, and then they wait 10 years, and then they look at what happened and decide if it was successful or not. And the idea was instead to try to develop a little bit of a prospective model. I'm not going to tell you anything about the model, but I mean, Claire, who knows my work, knows that like what I like are really just like minimal, clean models. That's the kind of modeling I do. So the model for this looks something like this. And it's because if you really are trying to quantitatively model something like this, there are a lot of things you have to deal with. So I won't talk you through this, but there's a lot of data input sources from the census and from the university and from other places. There's data that the university knows about, you know, attrition rates and all this sort of thing. And so we've worked up sort of like a Markov chain type of model that we're using to study this. And do I have time for one more?
Sure.
Okay, one more. Last one has to do with criminal justice. So what happens in the US court system is meant to be public. You can walk into court unless the judge has decided it's a closed proceeding. You can walk into court and see what happens there. But that data is never kept or made transparent in any way in the States, really. And so this is a project called Court Watch. These sorts of projects are springing up all over the States. They're typically focused on pre-trial hearings. So these are hearings before someone's criminal trial where what the judge is doing is setting bail. Like, will that person be released on bail or not? And some other aspects of the case. And so what Court Watch programs do is they send volunteer observers into the courts, and these people just sit there all day and fill out data sheets. Like, this person came in, this is what they had been arrested for, this is who the prosecuting attorney was, this is who the judge was, these are their demographic characteristics, like this is whether or not bail was given and how much, and some other things as well. And then we have partnered with Berkshire County Court Watch to analyze that data. And I'm not going to show you the results, but we put out a sort of like white paper about the preliminary results, and it got picked up by public radio, which was great. Citizen group collecting data on Berkshire courts releases preliminary report, and then our minds were blown because a few days later, they had Berkshire District Attorney responds to citizen collected court data. And so I'm sharing this only to say that like when you do this kind of work, if you put it out there, people will actually notice it, and you hope that it can start to make this much of a difference. Continuing with the criminal justice, US criminal justice system, in the US, there are federal guidelines for sentencing in the federal courts. Meaning, if someone does this crime, they're supposed to get between X years and Y years for it. But these are only guidelines. They're not binding, and judges can actually do whatever they want. And there's this guy, Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort was Donald Trump's campaign manager, and all the legal scholars thought that he would be sentenced for his crimes for 19 to 24 years, and instead he got 47 months. He got basically 4 years, and the legal scholars were quite perplexed by this departure from the sentencing guideline. And so we're working on a project, and it's important when you do this kind of work to be very diplomatic about it. And so what we're calling this project in my head is Shame Evil Federal Judges. And what we're trying to do is essentially give each judge a sentencing fairness scorecard. Now there's a huge legal literature already about sentencing disparities. This is like a thing that law professors do. What they haven't been able to do is identify individual judges in their work. And the reason for that is that the sources of data used to do their research specifically forbid it. So when the researchers get the data, they know what judges are doing what, but when they're publishing, they're not allowed to talk about individual judges. We have figured out a way to get the data from another source, mash up a bunch of data sets, and we've actually been able to unmask the judges and what they're doing, and so we will hopefully, in the next half year or year, be out with the scorecard of US federal judges. This is going to make a lot of people very mad at us. Are you ready for this, family? Yes? Okay. So that's the crazy story of this talk. And I think I'll just leave you with the main message again, and do we have time for a couple questions?
Yes, of course.
Yes. Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Thanks, questions?
Claire?
With the orchestra things, do you know if people have collected data on conductor's gender?
I don't know. That's a great question.
That would be really interesting.
Yes, it would be really
I mean,
interesting.
it's-
It's very low.
Anecdotally,
Yes,
they're on
it's
there.
quite low, yeah. I mean, in the US, we have a couple of major orchestra. Marin Alsop is the conductor of Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. We have like Sarah Hicks, who's an associate conductor of the Minnesota Orchestra, which is a quite good orchestra, but there are not a lot, for sure. Yeah.
More questions?
Yeah, please.
Have you been to the Auckland Art Gallery?
I've eaten there, it was lovely.
So it's not there anymore, so the time is like slightly off, but they had a giant exhibition on the girls.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, no,
Wow.
it was like all over the second floor, and they did some analysis of their own collection. I don't remember the conclusions that they had.
Okay, I will look that. Do you know if it's online? Oh, yes.
I went to the end, they were as bad as anyone else, but they made the pledge to change. I haven't checked since.
Yeah.
When you had that other study with the art gallery that invited you and the
Yeah.
correspondent to come, did they say that they were going to take any action to change or do anything like that?
What would you say? Because Jude was there too. What would you say?
So I asked them that question during the Q&A because I was in, and there was actually kind of, it was a mixed group. There were some different kinds of results. Like one of the faculty groups actually came out and sort of said, well, all the dead white men are the most popular artists, so just display that. And that, and, you know, that was
'Cause it'll bring
actually
people to the museum.
outcomes, right? So it was a sort of an interesting thing. There has been some movement in the States. I believe Baltimore actually has
Yep.
said they're going to be activists, curators, and collectors. They've just decided they're like 50% at least of all new acquisitions are going to be from women and people of color. So there is a movement toward that in some spaces. The National Gallery was a little more impressed with themselves for having looked at the data, but I'm hoping that we can help them become more activist in their approach moving forward.
So you said that the National Gallery could just decide tomorrow to put all minority people on the walls, but I don't think that's true. That's true of women because they
Oh,
have
maybe
things
not.
in their collection, but
Okay,
they
let's
don't
look.
have- They don't even have 1,500 things by.
I'm bad at multiplying. I'm really bad at multiplying. So let's figure it out.
They definitely do it for women.
Okay, let's see. So 111,000. What's 4% of that?
Oh, okay, it's 111,000.
Yeah.
I when I was thinking about this, I misremembered that Bacon.
Got it. Okay. Cool.
But certainly the response could be
Right.
that they could choose not to make the problem. So their problem is worse. They're making their problem worse, right? Which was the thing that we discovered with this is they're underrepresenting, and then underrepresenting on the walls.
Right.
Even more.
Even more.
So certainly they could at least represent their own.
Or at least prior to here. Prior.
They definitely need to buy more stuff.
Yeah, that's correct.
Well, and this is their pushback, right? Is that the way most art museums function is not like they just decide. I mean, they might go purchase some things at auction, but mostly people give them stuff, and they're like, and we can't. But they have to. Again, I'm expressing my frustration. They have this very helpless attitude, like, well, people just give us stuff, and there's nothing we can do. And I'm like, actually, there's rather a lot you could do.
They could have programs to drive acquisition amongst
Right.
potential future
Yes.
buyers, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
Oh, really?
So with the art gallery thing and this stuff in general, the maths one is quite easy because you can see, well, if there's 40% females in undergrad, then that should be 50% and if there's 30% in doctoral students, then that should be 40% because there's so many undergrads that aren't, so you can kind of just cascade that down. With something like the art or the music, I don't know what the targets, how we set those targets. Is it 50%? Because presumably like half of artists in the 1800s weren't women, just because this life situation was different back then.
Well, that's a great point, and this is where the art historian, this is why it's so important when you do this kind of work, not just to be your own like mathematical self, but to work with people who are actually experts in the thing that you're working on. Okay, because I think what the art historians would tell me is that actually like there were plenty of people, it's true maybe that life circumstances were less amenable for women making art, but that there were lots of women making things, and that the reason that we think they weren't is because of how history has treated them.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like what's shown to us from this vantage point, but that like maybe if we had had a different conception that we would know of more than we actually do. I don't know. Yeah, Riley.
I have just a question about, because all the artists' names are from art where the artist was known, right? And presumably a lot of these museums have
Yes.
all these items in their collection that are
Unknown.
you might assume are like made by people of color or something like that because they were stolen from countries.
Right. Right.
Right. And whether that was sort of, I mean, that's a whole other problem, right? But was that sort of considered?
Not at all. I mean, it was considered in that we know it is a limitation of the work, and so we discussed that a bit. But I think you're absolutely